Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sanctuary's Sunday School. I'm Minister Charlie Reep, they, them pronoun user. Very tired today, so we're going to see how this goes today. Today we're going to be learning about Biblical Marriage Part 2, but really today is going to be a lesson in 3 parts. We've kind of accidentally sort of did a mini-series on biblical marriage since so we did one February, March, and now in April. I'm not going to present a whole lot of new information today, but it's mostly going to be a recap of what we learned, followed by practical applications, which we're a little light on in the other 2 things. Because after all, what's the point of learning about ancient marriage customs in the 21st century from Israel to the US? And I will talk about that. But basically, the lesson in 3 parts. The first part is going to be a recap of everything we've learned from the last 2 months since we started this mini-series. So basically the basics of like women's roles and types of marriages in ancient times. The second part will be a look at expectations for Jewish men and women in marriage, to keep things simple because marriage customs evolved over time. And because I could have been here for like literally hours researching this, I was just looking at the marriage customs in like basically Old Testament times before the Babylonian exile. And then the third part is the reasons why modern day Christians need to know about this kind of stuff. Again, to keep things simple, I am focusing on just the marriage analogy that is used for Christ in the church and how it relates to the ancient concept of marriage. So we have this big, bold disclaimer. If you've seen any of our previous Sunday school lessons, you know I like to give caveats before we start. Today's no different. So basically, I want us to all be aware that this lesson and just Sunday school lessons in general are designed to give a brief overview of the topic. This is not seminary, this is Sunday school. And there's a ton of information out there that we couldn't possibly condense into 20-minute Sunday school lessons. All this information is accurate based on women to get married. Doesn't mean that all of them got married. Just because ancient societies had certain expectations for married men and women doesn't mean that people always lived up to those expectations. So people are complex, topics are complex, and there have always been people who have chosen not to do or be what society wants. With all that being said, we can jump in now. So the thing about biblical marriage is that it's nothing like what marriage is today in the US. So I compared it, I was going to have this really cool slide where it was like, I'm going to have this picture of this couple getting married in the US, and I'm going to slap an old-timey filter on it, put some sand in the background, and be like, this isn't the same. But no, it didn't work out like that. They could be getting married in Arizona, but they were like, it was way too late, and I was like, we'll just mention that, it's fine. But anyways, we can't just take what we know about marriage today and apply it to the Bible. That's not how it works. This is why we have Bible study topics and we actually dive into the history of things. I understand that history is not the most exciting for everybody, but that's why we're here, to make it a little bit more interesting. So if we want to understand not only scripture, but also the practical applications and even our relationship to Christ, we need to challenge our modern notions about marriage. And that's what we've been doing here at Sanctuary for the past few months. So what was marriage like in Bible times? So instead of being 2 adults who decided that they wanted just to start dating, couples in ancient times were set up by their parents from a young age. So girls could be married off when they hit puberty, which was around like 12 or 13 years old, while boys could be married off when they were 18 years old. However, it was common for young girls to be married off to men in their 30s, 40s, or even 50s. So another thing, instead of deciding to get married for love, like I talked about in our previous, I think it was last month, romance wasn't a thing until the 1700s, until Romanticism. Yeah, there was a whole movement named after that. Basically, romance wasn't a thing for Bible times. It's a very modern construct, but that means that couples in ancient times, instead of getting married for love, they would marry to unite their families together. So marriage in biblical times was ultimately about survival and status. Marriage contracts were called covenants, and they were used to form alliances against common enemies. They were used to support mutual borders, fulfill political goals, and ensure that any wealth that had accumulated over generations would be kept within families. And now status-wise, certain types of marriages like polygamy and concubinage prove that the families involved had enough money to enter into these expensive business transactions. And I say they're business transactions because that's basically what it was. Women were not considered people in ancient times. They were considered property, and so their marriages were more like business transactions. Whether or not that's right or wrong is an entirely different story, but that is just the reality of how things were. Let's see. So the man's family would give the woman's family a bride price for the woman, which could be negotiated based on the woman's perceived value to the men's family. The woman's family, in return, paid a dowry to the men's family. Now, if the woman's family couldn't afford a dowry because they were too poor, the woman couldn't get married. She could become a concubine for any man who would take her, but she wouldn't have the same rights as a wife. So if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend checking out either the Encyclopedia of the Bible, which is available online through Bible Gateway, or we have the past Sunday school lessons here on Facebook Live. We will eventually have them on YouTube for you to watch. We have the encyclopedia upstairs. I'm so excited. Okay. So in Discord stuff, cool. Yeah. Anyway, we have a Discord. Y'all should join it. Shameless plug. So that's the basics of marriage in biblical times. Let's move on to the expectations for men and women in these types of relationships. So the role of, like I said, this section especially I got from the Encyclopedia of the Bible, which has really comprehensive entries on marriage and related topics. I highly recommend checking that out. But like I said, this is a brief overview. So we'll start with the role of men in biblical marriages. Husbands were responsible for the basics. So they had to provide food, clothing, shelter, and medical care for their wives when needed. They were also commanded to have sex with their wives, as mentioned in Exodus 21:10. Conjugal rights were very much a thing. That's because having kids, preferably sons, was one of the ways that the husband and the wife both benefited from the marriage. So the husband needed sons to pass down property and the family name through, and the wife needed sons to be seen as blessed and highly favored. I threw in that line just for y'all.
Thank you so much.
Yes, blessed and highly favored. Now, husbands were also responsible for covering the cost of a tombstone and funeral arrangements for their wives. I did not put an example of this, but I believe Abraham did this with Sarah.
It was actually the first business transaction in the Bible.
That was the first business transaction in the Bible.
He had to buy the tomb, and
Okay.
then he bought a whole field with it. Yeah. What if he dies first?
That's a great question. I mean, nuances exist, I guess. So, yeah.
Or they might do it in advance, like people buy plots.
They could have done it in advance.
Like that. It's like, hey, when you're dead,
Yeah. But now here, interestingly, though, we're getting caught up on the funeral instance. This I find very, very interesting, this next part. Husbands were responsible for ransoming their wives if they got captured. So if you remember from Sunday school, all of the last series we did about it was called The Empires Strike Back. It was all about the superpowers of the ancient world. But basically, war between nations was so common that there was basically a provision, a duty for husbands in marriages to be like, hey, if your wife gets captured by invaders, you are duty bound to go ransom her. Because women were considered spoils of war. And in fact, one common type of marriage in biblical times was between soldiers and female prisoners of war. So yeah, that's that context. Yeah, so that's more context. It's like very ransoming them. Yeah, and we will talk more about the ransoming in just a little bit. I actually think in this next bit, when we're not talking about wives now, we're talking about kinsmen, because we don't ever talk about kinsmen. Yeah, exactly. So the husband wasn't the only man in the family with responsibilities in a biblical marriage. So if you're familiar with the book of Ruth, you might have heard of the term kinsman or kinsman redeemer used to describe Boaz. So any of the husband's male relatives would have been considered his kinsmen. And they were duty bound to intervene in situations where the husband died or his property was at risk of being taken. So I didn't include this example, but there was, what was it? Abraham had to go ransom his nephew Lot. Yeah. So Abraham, being Lot's kinsman, had to go like rescue him when he was captured in some war of 4 kings against 5. I don't exactly remember where that was. Yeah, because it was a whole hot mess. But basically, like, that was being an honorable kinsman and like going after your family and stuff like that. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to talk about it in the context of levirate marriage. So, yes, we're going to focus on the role of kinsmen in levirate marriage. So, if a woman's husband died and she had no sons to inherit property or preserve the family name, the late husband's nearest male relative was supposed to marry her. The book of Ruth is a great example of this because Ruth's husband died. Ruth had no children, and at the risk of being like poor and destitute, she had to go marry her late husband's nearest kinsman to like basically make sure that the property stayed in the family. Now, interestingly, this process was called redemption. And so if you're at all familiar with the church term of redemption, that is partially what it's based on. And that's why also in some translations of the Bible, you'll see the phrase kinsman redeemer used in the story of Ruth and Boaz. So that was pretty cool to have discovered. And now we're moving on to the role of women, specifically wives, in marital relationships. So wives were expected to have sons to inherit property and carry on the family name. The more children a wife had, the higher her status in society. But if she couldn't have children, she could persuade her husband to get a concubine, so he either wouldn't divorce her, which was incredibly common, or he wouldn't have to adopt a male heir to, keep the property in the family. So in cases where the wife had a female servant, she could just give the servant to her husband as a concubine. This happened specifically with Sarah and Hagar. I believe, and their concubines. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's considered, so it's an overlap between property marriage, because in property marriage, everything that the wife brings into the marriage belongs to her husband, and that includes female servants. But then concubinage, if you remember, it's like if a woman is too poor to afford a dowry, then she can become a concubine just to have some form of protection. So yeah, that is all of the new information that we're going to cover. Yes, you have a question. Okay, you have a question.
How did adoption work back then?
That is a great question. I have absolutely no idea. Okay. That would probably be a topic for a Sunday school lesson. You know how adoption. Okay, here. We're gonna. No, okay, we're gonna give you the mic so you can share.
All right. So I'm sharing for a minute too. Hi, I'm me. Okay. So y'all have seen me before. Okay. So adoption. Do you remember? They talk in certain parts of the Bible about taking the hand and putting it under the thigh with their servants. And I think they did it with Abraham. And I want to say somebody else did something like it, but I don't remember exactly where. Something in one of them, one of them books. It's one of the Old Testament things where there's a lot of stories, which doesn't narrow it down. But anyway, it's not a prophet. I know that much. So adoption was done, in other words, so the child by the concubine was considered a legal heir unless there was an actual heir. So like Isaac would have become the actual heir and replaced Ishmael. But up until that point, Ishmael, because he was the son of the slave, still had certain inheritance rights. And how they used to do it is that they would basically bind them somehow. So it's kind of like with marriage, like how you're joining the two families. They have a whole ritual and a whole rite and a whole thing that they do. When they would do that, they had something like that for adoption. And adoption would, just like the Bible talks about us being adopted as sons. In other words, we still have the same right. So through, like in the Christian context with Jesus, what Jesus did, now they use a lot of different illustrations with that we're basically, we became family through the blood of Christ, through the sacrifice that was made, and we are adopted into the family of God. So it's like there's an entire ritual that went along with it, and the whole thing, like putting the hand under, some people think that they actually like put it in here, some people think that they actually like sat on it. Usually when people demonstrate, they sit on it for the sake of modesty, but like that they actually like put it there, and it had some sort of significance, like being from the seed, or like being from that part of the body. Yeah. And so it was like there was a whole thing that went along with it. Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you for
You're welcome.
sharing.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Person. Okay. Whatever.
Which, speaking of professors, she is the chancellor of Acts 17:6 University, acts176.org. It's our seminary program. Go check it out. Highly cool, highly affordable. It's really fun. So now, before we move on, or I guess we are moving on, but I want to point out that marriage customs changed over time, and it would help if I went to the slide. So we even see that in the Bible, which I thought was very, very interesting. It's something we don't usually talk about in church, like how the term is progressive revelation, I believe, where it's like if we see something evolving from how God presents it to people through Scripture, it's called progressive revelation. But basically, the Encyclopedia of the Bible notes that marriage institutions that were common during the patriarchs, so think Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, eventually disappeared. And in fact, God gave Moses a series of laws that prohibited some of the stuff that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. So I have it listed up here. To recap, Abraham married and had kids with his half-sister Sarah. You can read about that in Genesis 20, verses 12. But later in Leviticus 18:9, God was like, hey, don't have sex with your sister, even if she is with a different parent in a different household.
And I just realized something about Jacob and Rachel and Leah. So Isaac and Rebecca were second cousins.
Isaac and Rebecca were second cousins, yes.
And Jacob and Rachel and Leah were cousins.
I forgot that they were also cousins.
Well, but then they were cousins from
Cousins.
second cousins.
So, cousins on top of cousins. And for those who could not hear, Nick said Alabama before Alabama existed. There's inbreeding jokes in here. I did not think those would come up during church, but anyways.
Cousins on cousins, like, wow, okay.
This is a personal headcanon about Scripture, but I think these verses, specifically in Leviticus 18, where God's like, don't have sex with your close relatives, is a lot about, hey, y'all don't know about this yet. Genetic inbreeding is a thing. Don't do it for this sake. Yes, what's up?
Could it also have been just because there were more people somewhere places?
Yeah.
It could have been, yeah. That is a yeah, and that's, I guess, where the progressive revelation stuff comes in. It's like, hey, this worked here because there was a different context, because you had a very, very small population pool. Now that you have a lot more people, don't do these old practices because they can cause more problems. Now we have more choices.
Still being done by certain nations that surround it.
Oh, easily. If I feel like if God had to say something, it was happening.
Yeah, like we said, the law wasn't just arbitrary. Like we said,
Yeah.
Don't eat a bat. Somebody was eating a bat. Okay.
Yeah. And the whole bestiality thing, it's like, okay, that's anyways, moving on. So yeah, Abraham married and had kids with his half sister, and then later God's like, don't do that. Isaac married and had kids with Rebecca, his second cousin. Some sources will say first cousin once removed, and I'm just like, it's like a generational difference. Yeah, and so I'm just like,
who they married.
Yeah, because she was the granddaughter of Abraham's brother. I was like, that sounds like second cousin behavior. So yeah, and then in Leviticus 18:6, God's like, don't have sex with any close relative. And then Jacob marries and has kids with Rachel and Leah, who are sisters. And later God says in Leviticus 18:18, don't take two sisters as wives while both of them are still living. So, yeah. It's still, yeah. But of course, we know that the law wasn't always something the Israelites followed. I mean, there was a whole commandment that I discovered in Deuteronomy 17:17, where God prohibited the Israelite kings from practicing polygamy. And God specifically had said something like, I know y'all are obstinate and you're going to ask for a king. And so I'm telling you straight up, do not have multiple women. And it's like clearly Solomon and David and Rehoboam did not get that message. They did, but they just didn't follow this rule. Yeah, they didn't care. But basically, I say this to point out that God made subtle changes to ancient marriage customs to set the Israelites apart as holy people. And this sort of brings me into my next slide, which is where we're getting to the why does it matter portion. So it's important for us to study ancient marriage customs, not only to just have intelligent conversations about scripture and to better understand what we're reading when we're going through the book of like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and being like, why is there some like West Virginia stuff happening up in here? I'm sorry, you were taking a drink of your soda. Anyways. Okay, good. But yeah, I mean, when we're reading all this stuff and we're just like, why is this happening? Like, why is this? And something I will say is that because the Bible was not written to Americans in the 21st century, it was written to Jewish people in like way back when. It was after the events had happened, but it was still long enough that they would have understood the context of ancient marriage, or I guess marriage customs back then, and so it didn't need to be stated. We, of course, do not know what those ancient customs are because we're reading all this text from like 2,000 years and like half a continent removed, and so we're just like, what is this? But yeah, so we just need to know about ancient marriage customs, just to understand the Bible, but also because the relationship between God and the Israelites and later between Christ and the church is compared to a marriage. And it's more of the business transaction type of marriage than our notions of romantic marriage. So because marriage was so common in ancient times, it was the go-to symbol of the relationship between God and the Israelites. And if you read any of the prophetic books, we've noted before that it sounds like God is a woman scorned because of how much God refers to being cheated on and to saying like, oh, my people have gone off to different gods, and it's giving both adultery and idolatry at the same time. So it's just so understanding the concept of biblical marriage customs and then going into these books will be like, oh, okay, this is why God is feeling like this, because marriage was a covenant, and and God had a covenant with Israel. And so it's very similar to a marriage. It's like you stay faithful to your spouse and you can expect things from each other. And if one of you is unfaithful, that's not good. That like is almost like breach of contract kind of thing. And then later, New Testament writers would use the same analogy to describe Christ's relationship with the church. I'm going to pick out just a few verses to reference because we could be here all day looking at references. But how about this? If you are part of our Discord group, and for anybody who is not online and not part of our Discord group, go to welcomeinThisPlace.org and go to we have a link. It's like about. We have basically a link to join our Discord group on our website. And so I highly recommend you join. We do weekly devotionals. We have prayer requests. We put in Christian memes. It's under the About section. So if you go to welcomeinThisPlace.org, you hover under the About section, it'll say something like join our Discord group. It'll take you directly to the platform. So for those of us who are in the Discord group, if you come across a passage that references like anything of what we've talked about in today's lesson, like put it in the chat. Let's discuss it. That'll be fun. So I have just a few verses that are, I thought about including Ephesians 5, and I was like, but that verse is always talked about. People like it is always the go-to, and so I'm like, you know what, because that one is decently familiar, let's talk about some that we haven't heard, like I don't know, Isaiah 54:5. Can you see? Yeah, and then specifically the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. So in speaking about the future glory of the Israelites, Isaiah notes, God calls himself their husband and Redeemer. This should remind us of the responsibility of a husband redeeming his wife from captivity. And that's exactly what happened. So God eventually brought the Israelites out of Babylon so that they could live in freedom once again. For a modern application, it could be a metaphor for how Christ frees us from our captivity to sin. What were you doing for?
Me?
Yeah, you were just like, oh.
Because even the language and the terminology that they used to refer to God referred to what the people were going through at the time. It wasn't random. When we
It wasn't
read the
random,
Bible
right.
today, we think that everything is random. We think
Yeah, because we don't have context.
because we don't have context, but it was not random. It was very specific language used that they would have understood because they were in captivity.
Yep.
Okay, they give us like
Yeah, so now we're moving on to the New Testament. I will say, like, lots of the prophetic writings use the Lord as husband. There was a reference in there to there. Yeah, I was thinking of, I cannot remember where it is, somewhere in Jeremiah, maybe. But basically, Baal had meant Lord, and like because they were like whoring themselves after, it did. And so God's like, okay, well, one day you will call me your husband instead of my Lord or Baal. So that is something I really want to explore.
Yeah, I know the passage you're talking about.
Yeah, because I don't quite, it was also really late at night when I was doing this, and I was like, I know that this is a thing. This has the potential to like blow my mind, but I'm too tired and too incoherent to be able to figure out what that is. So that was a thing. But now we're moving on to New Testament references. Jesus himself mentions in Mark 10:45 that his life is a ransom for many. So he was talking about servitude here, like the I think it was James and John are asking like, oh, how do we like sit on your right and your left? And Jesus is like, no, if you want to be the greatest in the kingdom of God, you have to be the most, you have to be a servant. So although he's talking about servitude in this context, it also reminds us of a husband's responsibility to pay ransom for his wife. And then Paul talks a lot about our relationship with God as a marriage. So here's a blink and you'll miss it nod to arranged marriage in 2 Corinthians 11, 2-4. So I've highlighted it on the screen, but it's like, I promise you to one husband to Christ, so that I might present you as a pure virgin to him. This is alluding to idolatry and adultery here by saying that following a Jesus other than the Jesus we preached, which was somewhere down here, is like a wife cheating on her husband. And that's why I want to end, and that's what I want to end with today, is the idea that because our relationship with Christ is like a business transaction, ancient type of marriage, committing idolatry is like cheating. And Nick is actually going to be talking about that kind of idolatry later on, so you'll want to stay tuned for that. But if you remember like nothing else from the Sunday school lesson, the one key takeaway is that as Christians, we are spiritually married to God. I'm talking married in the sense of the business transaction. I mean, I'm sure that there are some overlaps between modern marriage and what our relationship with God looks like, but for ancient marriage, so what?
There kind of is because.
Hold up, we're gonna give Nick the mic.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Nick. I have the mic right now. So the modern overlap would technically be, yes, we were bought, but we still have to choose Jesus. Salvation and grace are both gifts that we have to accept.
Fair.
So,
And so the original audience was more familiar, I guess, with the ancient concepts of marriage because modern marriage hadn't been invented yet and wouldn't be for another like 2,000 years. But yeah. Where was I going with this? Yeah, spiritually married to God. We were married in the sense of the business transaction. Yes, we were bought at a price. See 1 Corinthians 6:20 and 1 Corinthians 7:23. And that price was Christ dying on the cross for us. So that is redemption in the sense of like we have been freed from captivity, but also like in the church sense of redemption, like how it's usually used. Oh yes. So being married to God comes with two sets of expectations. So similar to husbands in ancient marriages, God is supposed to provide for us, not just food, shelter, clothing, medical care, all of that. He is supposed to ransom us from captivity, from our captivity to sin, and he is supposed to be spiritually faithful for us, faithful to us. And we know God is perfectly good at doing this. So one thing I will say is that we need to stop underestimating God for, oh, is God going to provide? Yes, God's going to provide. I'm sorry I'm in your sermon, but this is, no, this just kind of hit me. But like, we need to stop being like, oh, if God, no, God is going to provide. It's just, we got to hold out and wait for it. Yeah. And then another thing is, if God is always faithful, then like the ball is in our court to be faithful as well. And like, yes, we're human. Yes, we're going to screw things up. And like Nick said, we have to continually choose Jesus every single day. And thank God that God is gracious and continues to like forgive us, because the amount of times that we don't choose Jesus and it's like, oh, yikes. But yeah. Yeah.
Everybody doesn't get the context of that.
Mm-mm. So our basic responsibility at this point, so in a spiritual marriage, like we don't have spiritual kids through God. That's kind of weird. But in this instance, the faithfulness aspect is there. So like we don't cheat on God with any other like idols. So like we don't look to work for all of our provision, for the money to put like food on the table and a roof over our heads kind of thing. We don't look to a government system. We don't look to specific politicians. We don't look to, heck, our bosses to provide for us. We need to look to God as the source of all of this. And that's what it means to be spiritually faithful to God. Looking anywhere else for our basic needs to be met is akin to idolatry, and spiritually speaking, it is. Oh, well, it's akin to adultery, and spiritually speaking, it is idolatry. So, what's up? No worries.
So in that case, even modern day careers could be.
Oh yeah.
We have definitely discovered that. So for those listening, the question was asked like modern day careers would be idolatry. Like in some cases, yes. Like we in the U.S. have it's either called hustle culture, Protestant, or Puritan worth ethic, or whatever. But basically, we have this notion that we need to be working all the time, giving not only 100%, giving like 110%. And we have been met with employers who are just like, okay, I see that you're giving all of this to us. What if we gave you more work and paid you less? And because we have made work into an idol, we have made our careers in, yeah.
Your teammates.
Let's not trigger all the the corporate people watching. But yeah,
This is literally
yeah, which is why I highly recommend anyone who's watching this stay for Nick's sermon. It'll be like 2:30, 3 o'clock. It's gonna hurt, but you're gonna want to watch it. So yeah. Basically all this to say, like, we've all separately done stuff about how our work is idolatry, and we don't talk as a church, as the, unified church body, about how pervasive idolatry is these days. We think it's an ancient problem, like, oh, we don't bow down to statues, that's not us. It's like, no. We have concepts that we put our trust in more than God, and that's what counts as idolatry. So I will step off my soapbox for now, and I will let Nick preach later. Thank y'all for watching our Sunday school lesson. And yeah, like I said, stay tuned until Nick's message, because you will definitely want to hear it. So bye, everybody. See you in a bit.